All right, I hope this is fine.
Yes, sir, it's better.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so like I was saying, this morning we had a discussion about evolution of plants. Let me have a summary of that discussion and summarize the key points, because that conversation is guys, sorry, I got disconnected again. I think the internet connection is quite stable. So what I was saying is that if you explore that conversation, you get to realize that plants got more complex the farther they moved out of water. That is one. Second, the conversation also reveals that there is a huge evolutionary innovation So like I was saying, we move from water to dry terrestrial environment, and each of that processes of evolution would have specific evolutionary innovations that will drive it. We came face to face to see some of these innovations. For example, the development of vascular bundles for the transport of water. In that, we realized that vascular bundles were absent in the early cryptogams. And cryptogams, by that, I mean the algae predominantly. And we look at also the fact that vascular bundles were absent in the mosses and liverworts, that the bryophytes. Then we saw the presence of vascular bundles in pteridophytes, which are the fins. And then those vascular bundles were not efficient enough. They lacked xylem vessels, even though the xylem tracheids were there. And then the Gymnosperms came as an improvement upon the pteridophytes, in that pteridophytes had spores for reproduction, but Gymnosperms had naked seeds, and their roots grew deeper into the soil. Their leaves were well prominent, they grew tall, and then we got to have the modern day plants, the Gymnosperms, which has the most efficient vascular bundles and represents the most successful story in the history of plants that we have ever seen in the world. So let's quickly look at that again. Like I was saying, plants kingdom can be divided into the cryptogams and the phanerogams. The cryptogams are non-seed-bearing plants, and the phanerogams are seed-bearing plants. And so because of this, when you look at the cryptogams, plants that do not bear seeds, you see that you have the algae present there, you have the mosses and liverworts present there. That's the bryophytes. So you have the algae, you have the bryophytes, and then you have the pteridophytes. So typical algae, because this semester, for example, you guys are learning non-vascular plants, you know a lot about algae. And then you get to know about the bryophytes. Typical examples are mosses, liverworts, and all that. Then you get to know about pteridophytes. Typical examples, ferns, pteridophytes, ferns. Example, Dryopteris. You mostly see some of these ferns growing on palm trees and all that. So these are the non-seed-bearing plants: algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes. Then the seed-bearing plants are the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms. All right, so let's take it from the beginning. If you look at algae, algae are restricted to aquatic environment, from Euglena to the higher algae family, which are the Phyophyta, Rhodophyta, Basilarophyta. That mostly the higher algae, like you've known, are marine, and the lower algae are just freshwater restricted. What is very prominent about algae is to suggest that these guys are restricted to aquatic environment. They need enormous amount of water in order to survive. Also important to recognize is that they do not have true roots, they do not have true leaves, they do not have any effective mechanism for transporting water, transporting food, and they will just solely rely on the basic principle of diffusion and osmosis to just make life possible and keep going. It's also important to note that the concept of diffusion and osmosis and its overwhelming importance in cells and how that mechanism really happens has been largely explored in your cell function course this semester. And so I will not have to go into that mechanism. But second thing to note is that in as much as these plants are restricted to aquatic environments, they do not have any efficient systems, they perform the basic functions that we know of all plants, being producers of the ecosystem, being photosynthetic. They do that. Regardless of the colors that you see them having, they have one type of chlorophyll or the other. Even though they come in different colors and have different appearance than the traditional photosynthetic organisms, which you expect to be green. Some of them, for example, Phyophyta, which is brown algae, Rhodophyta, which is red algae, Biophyta, which is brown algae, Basilarophyta, you have Cyanophyta and all that. Their colors are due to the fact that they have different variations of chlorophyll present. So for example, you can have chlorophyll A, B, and C. Which type of chlorophyll present would have an impact on which color the algae has. And even if a combination of these chlorophylls are available, the proportion to which these chlorophyll appear. So for example, we have some algae that have chlorophyll A, B, and C, but the proportion of A is incredibly overwhelming and more than that of B. And so some of them too have chlorophyll combinations where you have chlorophyll C being dominant over the rest of the chlorophyll. And these will determine what color the algae should have. So the fact that they have different colors other than green is not indicative of the fact that they are not photosynthetic. In fact, chlorophyll in most modern day plants are seen to be green. That does not say that there's a single story of chlorophylls and every chlorophyll has to be green. So that should be well noted. That's an important criteria that any organism must be able to suffice in order to be put in a plant kingdom, which is photosynthetic ability. That criteria has been met by these algae, and so that's important. Their mode of reproduction is quite challenging. In in one way or the other, they will always need the availability of water to assist in their reproductive success. And that's also an important thing to know about these algae. Let's move fast forward from algae and go to the bryophytes, which is the next group under the cryptogams, the non-seed bearing plants. And this lands us to the doorstep of bryophytes. For bryophytes, you have typical examples like the mosses, the liverworts, the hornworts. And they, evolutionary, have been able to try a lot to break away from the locked chain with aquatic environment. I told you that the presence of water is much more fundamental to the existence of algae. So when the world started changing, the temperature of the earth started changing, the earth became drier and drier and all that. It was important for plants to develop an evolutionary innovation that enables them to survive with little to no water presence at all. And what plants would do in that particular regard was to move away from water gradually. And so unlike the algae which live in water particularly, you have the bryophytes restricted to dry, moist terrestrial environment. So they are on land, not in water, but the places on land where they are places where there is water, like moist areas. So for example, if a house is in a waterlogged area where the walls are always, the bottom part of the walls are always moist and wet, you see some of these bryophytes, the mosses, green on the walls, green like that. And if you have a pond or a lake at the periphery, close to where the main water sources, where the place is always kept wet, you see these bryophytes growing around there. The case is that even though they do not live in a pool of water directly, they still need to be having a close proximity with water such that the place must be moist. So in terms of, even though they need water, in terms of water affinity, it is not as much as the algae that must be in a pool of water. They just need some moisture and they can do with that. So that's an important difference between their level of success. So it means that if they live in a pond and there's a pond where algae lives and the pond gets dry and keeps drying, but there's just a little bit moisture, algae will find it very difficult to survive, but bryophytes would manage to survive there. And that will be the evolutionary advantage that they have. And that will be the level of complexity that they have attained over their close people and their close plants in that particular hierarchy. Second thing that will happen is that apart from the ability to survive in a little bit drier environment, they would have a more robust system of reproduction where they would have the ability to undergo sexual reproduction. It is important to note that even though some algae have the potential to undergo sexual reproduction, one thing that really happens within the bryophytes particularly is that they, for example, they have the male part that produces a male sex cell, which is called an enterozoid, and then they have the female part, which produces the female egg, which is the egg is the oogonia, and then you have the archegonium, which is the chamber that produces that egg. And that's the sperm, the enterozoid, needs to swim through a film of water by detecting chemical signals like the presence of malic acid and getting to fertilize those eggs for sexual reproduction to happen. While Whilst this is similar in the case with some specific groups of algae, you should realize that a wide range of algae also have some increasing diversities amongst them. So, for example, if you take Euglena, let's take Spirogyra for instance. Spirogyra, which is an algae, it has the opportunity to use either binary fission or fragmentation as a means of reproduction, which is asexual, it's a non-sexual means. And so in the specific context of binary fission, the cells would divide into two and cause the elongation of a filament. In the case of fragmentation, the long filaments of Spirogyra would break, and then you have two different Spirogyra filaments which are capable of assuming independent livelihood and survival in that particular regard. So that is an important thing to notice, that the lower algae have varied forms of reproduction, and when it gets to the higher algae, they get quite complex with reproduction. But then in the case of the Bryophytes, they have that specific sexual reproduction patterns that helps them to have a competitive advantage. But even with that, the obstacle that arises is that there must always be the presence of a film of water for that to happen. Why is that the case? Because the sperms that are produced, the enterozoites, always would need a film of water to swim to that chorionium to fertilize those eggs. Even if that's the sperms are produced, the eggs are produced directly, and there is no film of water for that swimming to happen, fertilization cannot happen in that regard. And also the malic acid and other chemical indicators that are released by the chorionium to attract the enterozoites need films of water to be able to cause them to spread from. And so the use of water in their fertilization also becomes incredibly important. Yeah. Also notice that bryophytes do not have true roots, they don't have true leaves, and so transport is also a problem. So even in their evolutionary success, they are being able to move away from the water. They still have a challenge with water transport, even though they do better than the algae. So they still rely on diffusion and osmosis for basic systems of transport, and that will be just enough to survive them for the most part of their life cycle. And notice that alternation of growth by them is also something that really helps them. Their gametophyte generation, their sporophyte generation is also an evolutionary advantage that they have over the algae. And that innovation particularly has been very influential in their evolutionary success. So let's look at the pteridophytes. How are pteridophytes more complicated than these two that you mentioned, the algae and the bryophytes? Pteridophytes, typical example, ferns like Dryopteris, for example. For the first time in the history of plants, these plants have true roots, they have true stems, they have true leaves. But they are vascular bundles. When you look at the xylem, which is supposed to be for the transport of water and mineral salts diffused within it, those vascular bundles, if you look at the phloem, they lack vessels. And so the major transporting tissue are just the xylem tracheids. And you know that tracheids are less efficient in the transport of water as opposed to vessels because of the cross walls that exist at the inner walls of the tracheids. And so, for example, in terms of efficiency, you would say that xylem vessels are about 95% efficient in transporting water. Tracheids are about just 25% efficient in transporting water. And these pteridophytes do not have the vessels which are most efficient. It means that even though they are able to conduct water through their stems and all that, it will still be significantly not effective. And so because of this, these plants are not able to grow so tall and big like we see in the modern day plants that have xylem vessels. And that explains their level of dominance and the sizes that they assume and the heights that they can go, because they don't have a lot of these robust water transport systems. But an interesting thing that still happens in the life cycle, in the evolutionary journey of pteridophytes, is that for the first time, they break the odds with how reproduction should be, with a primitive binary fission, the primitive sexual reproduction, needing a film of water and all of those things, to a proper form of reproduction that can happen on land without any film of water being required in that particular regard. And so, because these are able to live in the driest of terrestrial environments, they need to really have a method of reproduction sexually that will still not be dependent on the availability of films of water and all that. So what they do is that they're able to develop spores. And what these spores are able to do is that they preserve the embryo in them such that when the spores are dispersed, then germination does occur and these plants are able to produce their young ones. But the problem with spores is this. Spores, as compared to modern day seeds that we have, are less stronger, less resistant, and do not resist most of the harsh conditions that exist in the environment. What this implies is that it is very easy, for example, for fungal or microbial infestation to destroy these spores. But also, harsher weather conditions can also just rid off these spores. But next means that it is incredibly difficult for any mode of dispersal far away from the territories of these plants. So it means that diversity in terms of space and reach and global distribution of these plants is going to be restricted, as opposed to modern day plants, for example, that dispersal can happen wide ranges because of reasons that I'll talk about later. So we have come to a point where you realize that when you look at the presence of stems, for instance, from algae, you don't have true roots and stems and leaves. In Bryophytes, you don't have true roots, true stems, and all that. But in pteridophytes, you have true roots, you have true stems, you have true leaves. In Bryophytes and algae, you have forms of reproduction that will largely depend on water, sexual reproduction that will largely depend on water. Here with pteridophytes, you do not need water for that mechanism of reproduction. But then secondly, pteridophytes are able to develop spores, which can be preserved for some time. And that means that they increase their chances of reproductive success. And you know that in evolutionary sense, reproduction is the most important thing. How many offspring you're able to contribute to the next generation is the most important consideration in your success story. And these guys are able to do that better by just forming spores. So that is the end of the story with the cryptogams, these plants that do not produce seeds. So let's look at the phanerogams, those that produce seeds. And that you have the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. It's important to recognize that gymnosperms are divided into cycadophyta and coniferophyta, the cycads and the conifers. And even though you don't see them within these areas, they are mostly restricted to the temperate zones. But because of an ornamental purpose, you see some of them being planted around, like the Christmas trees, the pine tree, they are all gymnosperms. Now, what difference do the gymnosperms do as higher plants above the pteridophytes? First, gymnosperms are able to assume a more regularized vascular system. So even though they still don't have xylem vessels, they still have very more powerful vascular bundle system, and their roots are deep reaching and penetrating to deeper layers of the soil to tap water for them. Also, importantly, in the gymnosperms, they are able to, for the first time ever in the history of plants, to produce seeds. But the problem is that these seeds produced by gymnosperms are naked seeds, and they are not enclosed in a seed coat or a tester. What this suggests is that even though these seeds can have a wide reach of dispersal and can be preserved more than the spores in the pteridophytes, they can still have some level of susceptibility to fungal attack and microbial infestation, and even damage from harsh weather conditions. So they have not arrived yet, even though they do a lot by being the first in the plant's evolutionary history to produce seeds. Recognize that the production of seed in the plant's evolutionary story represents a milestone that breaks all the difficulties that plants have had with reproduction and all of those things. Like, it's a very important evolutionary innovation to happen in plant kingdom. Now, out of that, there is further evolution happening, and that evolution journey would lead to the production of the modern day plants, which are the angiosperms, the next seed producing plant. These angiosperms uniquely are able to be very successful because of their ability to produce flowers. And flowers means that they would assume a more easy form of reproduction through pollination that would easily cause fertilization to happen. And after fertilization happens, fruits and seeds are produced. So they produce fruits, and the fruits, because most of them are edible fruits with succulent mesocarps and all that, would attract a lot of animals. And these animals feeding on the fruits will then disperse the seeds at wide geographical ranges. That suggests to you the reason why angiosperms, in terms of geographical distribution, are found at all spaces of the world and not limited to specific areas like you do have some plants. So the possession of that ability to produce fruits with their seeds inside means that dispersion is far enhanced, because animals are always feeding on these fruits and they do disperse them. Even you humans have played significant roles in dispersing a lot of fruits. You buy orange in Kumasi and go and eat it in Accra, and they throw the seeds away. That is huge dispersal that the plants could have never come close to achieving, but for the fact that the seeds were enclosed within the fruits that you eat. A bird can come and eat the fruits and then swallow the how do you call it, the seed. Even other primates can swallow the seed, then release it in their excreta elsewhere, and that also has the ability to germinate. But why is this possible with this wide range of dispersal? Because unlike the gymnosperms that have naked seeds not enclosed in a seed coat, angiosperm seeds are enclosed in a seed coat. That is why even if it's swallowed, it will still be preserved. It would have resistance against microbial infestation and harsh weather conditions and all that. That means the highest form of reproductive success in plants is achieved in angiosperms just by the production of seeds with seed coat. That's why they far dominate the gymnosperms, that particular area. So notice that evolutionary innovation as very important and critical for the gymnosperms. There's a lot to be said about the angiosperms. Sorry, there's a lot to be said about these angiosperms, but the most crucial are the fact that one, and also notice their vascular bundles, the xylem also has vessels. That means they are more able to transport water efficiently as opposed to the Gymnosperms and Pteridophytes in that particular extent. And also, even in their phloem, you have the sieve tubes and you have proper companion cells that are able to regulate the activities of the sieve tube in transporting food. You don't see companion cells in Gymnosperms and Pteridophytes. Instead, you see albuminous cells, which are pseudo-companion cells, do not perform the function of companion cells. Even though they try to perform that function, they don't perform it as efficient as companion cells would do. And so it's an incredible journey in the history of plants, moving from one stage to another, getting little complex and complex and complex to the modern day plants that we have. And so this should give you an appreciation of how evolution happened in the plant kingdom, and any evolutionary innovation that plants are doing would cause them to be able to overcome major challenges and then dominate. The highest plants today, which are the angiosperms or the flowering plants, have dominated all phases of the earth and constitute more than 90% of available plant species that we see in terms of the numbers on land, not to talk about the algae, which also primitively in water do well. This has been because of their superior evolutionary innovation, and they dominate everywhere. You see just a few Gymnosperms around and a few Pteridophytes, and most of the plants you see around are angiosperms, flowering plants, because of this evolutionary innovations of the seed, of vascular bundle, of true stems, of flowers that they have. Because the possession of flowers alone speeds up the fertilization process. Because flowers just attract insects. Insects will just cause a pollination. Wind can cause pollination. So multiple agents of pollination that speeds up the rate of fertilization in several folds that would have happened if the flower did not exist. So at this point in time, I'll take a few questions about plants. If there are no questions, I'll go to animals quickly, because tomorrow we still talk a little bit about animals, and we do most of the discussion tomorrow will be on exploring a few questions. But I'll try as much as possible to get about 20 to 30 minutes today to go through a few questions. But I'll take a few questions from you if there are any. Akabwa again.
Yeah, sir, please, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon.
I want to know whether if plant a seed like a fruit like mango, the seeds in it. So when we take one fruit of mango, the seeds in it, are they genetically similar?
So notice
like
that
one mango fruit, the seeds in it.
In order to understand what's going on, especially
No, I'm talking about orange, rather orange. Sorry.
It's the same thing you are talking about. So let me explain. In order to appreciate what you are asking very well, you first need to understand how seeds are formed and how they come about in the first place. You need to really understand this. And you need to understand that in plants, they have male sex cells and female sex cells. And that the male sex cell and a female sex cell fusing together would form a seed. But how is a seed formed? And how are the male sex cells and female sex cells going to come together? Now, when you take the anther of a flowering plant, it contains pollen grains. In the pollen grains, we have the male sex cells and pteridium in the pollen grains. And then go into the ovary. In the ovary, you see the ovule. In the ovule, you have the female sex cells in there. There are some plants that produce just one female sex cell or one egg, and there are some plants that produce many eggs. What this means is that all the plants that produce one seed in a single fruit produce just one egg. And those that produce multiple seeds, like orange, as you say, produce more than one egg. So when pollination happens, what happens is that the anther, which contains the male sex cells, finds a way to be discharged onto the stigma. The stigma collects it based on its sticky nature, and then a pollen tube develops from the stigma and grows down into the ovarian wall. The pollen tube breaks into the ovarian wall, enters the ovarian wall, and get access to the ovules. That's when the male sex cells that are inside that pollen tube are able to get contact with the female eggs, and then the fertilization does happen. So if there's one egg present in the case of mango, only one will be fertilized. If there are a number of eggs, just as in the case of orange, all of them will be fertilized because there are many male sex cells within a pollen grain. But if just one, only one will be successful to fertilize, just like you have in human sperms and all that. So to understand the issue of genetic variability and likeness, you need to then understand, now knowing that it is no different from how fertilization happens in humans and any other organism. Now get to realize how these sperms and eggs are produced. The male sex cell or the sperm, anterozoite in the pollen grains, and then the female sex cell within the ovary. How are they produced? They are produced by just the simple process of meiosis. Okay, so meiosis happens, then the anterozoites or the male sex cells are produced in the pollen grains. Meiosis happens, and then the eggs are produced. So just like no two individuals that are giving birth by the same parents are genetically alike, all the seeds, individual seeds in the plants are not genetically the same. There's some variation that exists between them because of the fact that they are a hybrid of both the male plants and the female plants coming together. So it's the same thing that you've been doing. So when you're doing Mendelian genetics, when you do the cross, male plants, female plants, and then a tall plant mates with crosses a short plant, and then you get all the offspring to be tall, and a red flowered plant, a white flowered plant, and you get all the offspring to be red. And F2, you get some of them red, some of them white, all those things. It's the same thing that happens. So all the offsprings you were getting in the Mendelian crosses you were doing in first semester, they were not real plants, they were seeds that you were talking about. You're actually doing the process. Whatever you got, I say, oh, this one offspring, they were actually seeds that will grow to become the individuals. Yeah.
It's here. Where
Aquabuan, do you get it now? Evangeline, mute yourself.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Peter. Peter Saki, let's hear from you. Okay, it looks like Peter is not available at the moment. So, guys, at this juncture, let me just give an overview of the animals, animal evolutionary story, and then we'll get to a few questions and then move. But before then, yeah, Daniel. Daniel, your hand is up.
later from what Aquabo asked, can't it be that different foreign grains will fertilize different eggs? What if an instance like that happens? Would they still have the same genetic makeup?
Come again. What did he say?
From I was saying from what Aquabo asked, can't it be an instance whereby the seeds are being were being fertilized by different sperms or foreign grains? In that instance, won't there be genetically different, or they will still be the same?
I have a feeling that you did not listen to me. And if you listen to me, you did not get what I said. I said that if there is just one seed, it will be fertilized by just one sperm or one anterozoid. If there are multiple seeds, different sperms will fertilize them. So you did not really follow what I said. I'm saying actually the same thing. And because of that, there is actually genetic variability and diversity among all the seeds that are produced by one fruit. You get it now? So it is not one sperm that fertilizes all the various eggs that are available. One sperm, one egg.
Okay, I get you now. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Amma.
Sir, please.
Amma, I can't hear you. It looks like we lost. Your mic is on, but I'm not hearing anything. All right. If Amma is not showing signs of speaking, let's move on. I said that you're going to have the introductory part of evolution of animals, and then we have that conversation tomorrow before we solve the questions. But I also make time available for us to explore a few questions today. Now, it's important to realize that the origin of all animals that we have on Earth can be traced to just a common ancestor, even though they have different morphological appearances as we talk now. Structural organization and complexity are evident today, but regardless of all of these things, we can still trace them to a common ancestor. And notice that evolution is a long-standing process that happens over years, and that can lead to differences that you will never imagine occurred out of the same thing. But there are reasons why we are able to support the ideas that these things happen to split organisms into different groups to have that wide diversity that we have. Because regardless of everything, there is still a lot of similarity, regardless of appearance of different forms of animals and all that. There is still incredible similarity that nobody really seems to pay attention to. The fact that if you take a cell of every organism or every animal, the components of the basic units of that organism, which the cell, do not show so much difference. Look at the organelles. Look at the cell inclusions. They are almost the same all the time. Just a little bit of variation. They have a cell membrane, they have nucleus, they have organelles performing the same functions and all that. So you realize that at the heart of the conversation, at the very core of our makeups, we are just the same thing. But as the organization goes on, then there is complexity. Look at DNA. DNA is strikingly similar and found in all species that that exist. That tells you that we might have something very close, something in common that gave all of us DNA. Look at other biomolecules like proteins, like carbohydrates. All of us organisms have it. We must have shared something closely similar to have been given all of that. So that is very important. But a number of fields of sciences and taxonomy, systematics, evolutionary biology have made specific attempts to classify and group organisms in different taxonomic groups. And that enables us to appreciate the kind of relationships that exist, how different each group is from another, and how similar members within the same group are. And that gives us a close appreciation of which group, which organisms took the same path on the evolutionary ladder, and which one of them branched on the evolutionary tree. So taxonomy is an important science that will be used in this course. And notice that your knowledge in taxonomy, that's why I said classification, especially in SHS, your principles of systematics you did last semester, your invertebrate zoology, your non-vascular plant, all of those knowledge will be hugely leveraged on in this course. But the exam will test you on all of these things to be reminded. Now, the animal kingdom has 35 different phyla, which are put in 11 major phyla. And it's important to also recognize that we will have a discussion on protozoa with respect to the various species of microscopic measurements, as well as the links between them and plants. So if you take protozoa, which are animal-like, for example, you realize that even though they have a close affinity to animals, higher animals, there are still some traces that links them to the plants group. That's an important thing that we also look at as the discussion goes on. So we would have to talk about protozoa, we talk about prolifera, and another group of animals that are also worth looking at are the coelenterates, Coelenterata. And in embryology, you need to understand what body plan means. When the cell starts to divide, when fertilization happens, the single cell, which is the egg that has been fertilized, starts to divide prolifically in a lot of mitotic division. And that division along several planes and all that, that will lead to the formation of the individual organism, the offspring that will be produced. So it goes through different stages and different patterns of division, and we give them specialized names. In third year, you guys will do this course called Chordate Development and Evolution, and you study this thing. Some of the principles include, for those who want to read just for reading sake or watch videos to see how these things happen, you can read on blastulation, B-L-A-S-T-U, blastulation. You can also read on grastulation, G-R-A-S, grastulation, and then blastulation. And then you can read about morphogenesis. That's where the organs begin to form at their respective positions and all that. All these are sub-stages that happen during embryology, the development of the embryo to the full organism. You can get a lot of videos on the embryogenesis of the chick, which has been largely studied, and you'll see how the chick egg actually divides along several planes, blastulation, gastrulation, and then we get morphogenesis happening, then we form a chick. At the end of the day, then you get to appreciate these things. But what I want to say today is that during embryogenesis, we have organisms that develop around 2 planes, and then we have those that develop in 3 planes. Now, organisms that have 2 planes of division are called diploblastic organisms. Diploblastic organisms. And organisms that develop around 3 planes are called trichloroplastic organisms. Trichloroplastic organisms. So for trichloroplastic organisms, they have an outer layer called the ectoderm, then they have a middle mesoderm, and then they have an inner endoderm. Yeah. So let me try to draw, and then you will appreciate what exactly is going on. Trying to share screen. Just share white spot. Can you all see the white spot? I think it's visible. So the outer layer, then the middle layer being the mesoderm, and then the inner layer will be the endoderm. So this is a triploblastic organism. Triploblastic. This is a triploblastic organism. It has 3 layers, embryological origin. You have the outer ectoderm, you have the middle mesoderm, and then you have the inner endoderm. Now, if there is a hole, a perforation, a hole in the middle, there's a hole in the middle here, and that hole is called, that cavity is called coelom. Coelom. If that hole is there, or that cavity or the coelom is there, then the organism is a coelomate. Coelomate, as in coelomata. Coelomate. If it is not there, then the organism is an acemate. So organisms that have that internal cavity, like inside their endoderm, that's the presence of a coelom are coelomate, and those that do not have it are the acoelomate. And so you can have, if the organism has 3 body plans, like the endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm, and a coelom is in the middle, then that is a coelomate. So in that case, because the organism is first trichoplastic, and you know trichoplastic because it has 3 body layers. If there's a coelom in there, then it's a trichoplastic coelomate. Trichoplastic coelomate. That's not your. That's a triplo. Oh. Trichoplastic coelomate. We have 3 body layers with a cavity or coelomate, a coelom inside, so they are trichoplastic coelomate. If you have 2 layers, the inner endoderm and the outer ectoderm with no mesoderm, then that's a diploblastic organism. And so if the diploblastic organism has a coelom, it's a diploblastic coelomate. If it doesn't have, it's a diploblastic acoelomate. And that's important. So you can have triploblastic coelomates like humans. We have an internal body cavity. So your digestive system, for example, for your mouth to your anus, that's an internal body cavity. So humans, for example, are coelomates. If you look at organisms like tapeworm, they have no body cavity, internal cavity, so they are acoelomates. So that's why they belong to acoelomata. They are acoelomates. Roundworms are coelomates. Flatworms are acoelomates. Platyhelminths, they are not coelomates in that regard. So notice this as a matter of fact. So coelentrates have mostly coelomates, and they are a group of and also we have what you call bilateral symmetry and radial symmetry. I think from your SHS, you should probably know about it. Let me still look at it regardless. Let me clean this first. So for organisms that have 2 body planes, you can divide them into 2 directly. They have a bilateral symmetry. And those that can be separated along several planes, they have a radial symmetry. So human beings, for example, you can divide us along 1 plane. From the head, you cut down. So let me draw one of those human beings that I used to draw in KG1 to explain this. This, guys, who do you think this resembles?
Adiga.
So you can divide along, let me change the color of the pen. You can divide this individual into 2. So the head is divided, 1 ear here, 1 ear there, and 1 eye here, 1 eye on the left as well. You have 1 hand on the right, 1 hand on the left. Afua, please off your video. You have 1 leg on the right, 1 leg on the left. So we divided the organism into 2 completely. That's why you get a complete division into two symmetrical parts. So if the organism has one line of symmetry, that means you can divide into two, just two identical or symmetrical parts. It's a bilateral symmetry, bilateral. Then you have an organism like, say, starfish. Starfish that looks like this. You can divide it along several planes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like several lines of symmetry. So starfish, for example, has, how do you call it? A radial symmetry. So you understand the difference between bilateral symmetry and radial symmetry. These are concepts that are very important in understanding a number of things. So you hear things like radiata that are typically having tentacles. Example is Hydra. Hydra, for example, has a radial symmetry. Asomata, annelates, arthropoda, all of these things are things that we need to look at. But let's push that to tomorrow. And then I'll also be very much interested about mammals in particular. So for now, let's try to see if we can explore a few questions and then we move. Any question up to this part?
Oh, we show him.
Any question? If you don't have a question, make sure your microphone is muted at all times. Any question before I move on? In the absence of any question, I would ask a few questions instead. In evolution of plants, when did the possession of true roots, true stems, and leaves first appear? Guys, if I find out that your microphone is unmuted, I will remove you from the class. I told you this, that the class is being recorded. Do not distract it. Rosfrin Paul. Peter Bryophytes, let's hear from you.
Okay, so I think it's under Pteridophytes. Pteridophyta.
And what are some of the prominent members there?
Fence and its allies. Bryopteris. I think Bryopteris, right?
Bryopteris is just a species, just a type of.
So fence, and its allies.
The fighter, that's where it started. And next follow-up question for that. What did that evolutionary innovation do to the success story of those organisms? What did it do? Peter, you can just, what do you think the development of true roots and true leaves and true stems did for their evolutionary journey?
I think it helped them in the transport of water and food. The true roots, they had tracheas, which helped them to transport water. And I think the with the leaves to help them with food. As in, they had phloem cells in them that help them with the food production of food. So that is one thing that I can say about it.
Okay. Thank you very much. So let's use the rest of the time. Okay, Iyada, your hand is up. Maybe that's probably in respect to the question I asked, but let's move straight to solving a few, questions and then remove. Yeah, I want to show. So you have 15 minutes. Let's see if we can do a lot. Let's look at question 80. Start from 80 downwards. So question 80 reads, the evolution of vertebrates A is believed to have proceeded from the cephalochordates. B is most likely tied to erochordates. And C is probably in a lineage apart from present-day invertebrate chordates. Then D possibly proceeded from cephalochordates to hemichordates. I think tomorrow, if you explore the animal kingdom better, some of these things would become quite clear. But the answer here is that the evolution of vertebrates is probably in a lineage that is quite different. That's apart from present-day invertebrate chordates. So that's what they say. That evolution of vertebrates seem to be quite different in lineage from the present-day invertebrate chordates. Question 81 says that invertebrate evolution, the appearance of vertebral column led most directly to the development of, and once again, that's a specific knowledge that you need to have. It led to the possession of jaws. Yeah. So we have other options here, limbs such as arms and legs, sense organs and nervous system, more efficient breathing system, greater speed of locomotion. All of these things preceded the evolution or the appearance of the vertebral column. And the presence of vertebral column corresponded with the evolution of jaws. And that's what the fossil records tell us as it stands now. So when you see questions like this, it tells you what to be paying attention to and what extra materials you should be reading apart from what you've done in class. Question 82 says, creeping behavior and mouth located towards the head end of the body may have led to the, let me take it again, creeping behavior and mouth located towards the head end of the body may have led in some evolutionary lines to, and the answer is concentration of sense organs in the head region. Now, in evolution, the head wasn't always located at the mouth wasn't always located at the anterior part of the body, which is the head region. Most of the times, they were located at the under surface, and you still have some organisms that still have their mouth even located at the anal region. So in most organisms, the mouth was shifted to the upper part of the body, the head, and that caused the concentration of sense organs at the head region. So for example, if you see humans, because your mouth is located at the head region, you have your eyes, you have your ears, you have your nose, lots of critical sense organs located at the head region. And that's the same with a lot of other organisms. In evolutionary story, that is the reason. Question 83 says, which of the following classes is represented only by fossil forms? And this also something that you must know as a matter of fact. I think apart from seeing it in a question like this, there's nowhere you could have come close to knowing that this really exists. And the answer is Placodermi. These organisms, that class in classification is only represented by fossils. In classification, there are organisms that belong to certain classes that none of them exist. So all members of that class are fossils. We have their bones or fossil, other forms of fossil records, and we can use that description to place them in a certain class or a taxonomic group, even though none of those organisms exist. Ebenezer, any info? So I've removed him. Anybody who just unmute themselves, I'll just remove you from the class. I told you guys from the beginning that the class is being recorded, so do not disturb. Another person removed. So Placodermi is one of the classes that have no members currently existent. So there are no extant members. All the members in that particular class are extinct. They are all extinct. Yeah. 84. The most primitive but still existing vertebrates are members of the class Agnatha. So we see that Placodermi, all the members are extinct. But in Agnatha, all the members are primitive. They are very, very primitive, simple organisms, but they are still existing. And they are vertebrates as well. So that's Agnatha. In 85 says that the feeding habits of lampreys are best described as parasitic. So lampreys are parasitic organisms. They are lower chordate organisms. You actually learn a lot about lampreys in third year when you do chordate development and evolution. 86. All but the following have cartilaginous skeleton. And the answer is tilapia. You know, all these are fishes. Shark is a fish, lampreys are fishes, rays, rayfish, those are all fishes. You should understand that in fishes, you have class ostrichids and class chondrichids. The ostrichids are they are bony fish, and the chondrichids are cartilaginous fishes. So those fishes they used to do kako, most of the kako, the fish they used to do, that do not have any bones in them, but they are cartilaginous. Most of them are cartilaginous. But my attention is also the fact that in these times, they still use some other fishes that even have bones to do kako and all that. But typically, the most prominent fish they used to do not have cartilages. A shark has no bones. It just has very, very strong cartilages. And just like the cartilages in your ears, your ear doesn't have any bone. Your ear is just made up of cartilage. And there can be cartilages that are very, very strong. Yeah. So tilapia is a bony fish. It's not a cartilaginous fish. So the question was asking, all but the following have cartilaginous skeletons. And the odd one out is tilapia, which is a bony fish. The rest are cartilaginous fishes. Which of the following statements is false? And A, you have shark's teeth are modified scales that are continuously shed and replaced. This statement is true. The teeth of the shark are modified scales and they are continuously shed and replaced. Second option says many fish use a swim bladder to provide buoyancy. That's true. There are some fishes that have swim bladder, and so they swim at the surface. They can float at the surface of the water when they are not swimming because of the presence of a swim bladder. And because of that swim bladder too, most of them are able to use that to survive briefly when there is no water available, when they're in terrestrial environment at the shores of the water. Then this one is what is false. Bony fishes were ancestors of cartilaginous fishes. That's not true. It's rather cartilaginous fishes that were the ancestors of bony fishes. And so bony fishes are advanced, more advanced than cartilaginous fishes. Because if you look at the formation of bones, you realize that cartilages precede bones. It is the calcification of cartilage that leads to the formation of bones. So if bones are going to be formed, we have certain cartilage, for example, hyaline cartilage. We do this in anatomy also next semester, population genetics and human anatomy and physiology. You get to know about various types of tissues. You realize that hyaline cartilage, for example, can be calcified. Calcification means that they are mineralized with minerals such as calcium phosphate. That's what makes them hard to become bones. So you must have cartilage before you can form bones. So bony fishes are modern, more recent than cartilaginous fishes. So cartilaginous fishes are the ancestors of bony fishes. So it is not true that bony fishes are the ancestors of cartilaginous fishes. That's the answer as well. But D is also a true statement that ray-finned fishes are the most numerous and diverse of the fish groups. And that's quite interesting. Ray-finned fishes are the most numerous and diverse of the fish groups. Then the lobe-finned fishes have the ray-finned, give rise to the ray-finned fishes. So ray-finned fishes have the ancestors to be the lobe-finned fishes. That's also something that's important. Also, so guys, notice that as you go through these questions, you're also having the opportunity to get to understand the field. I said anybody who just unmutes themselves, I'll just remove you. So just watch it. 88. Which of the following is associated with lobe-finned fishes? Lobe-finned fishes have lungs. So they don't have cartilage, they don't have replaceable teeth, they don't have dermal rays, they have lungs. All right. 89. Amphibians are most likely to have evolved from fish and lobe, how do you call it? Fins, fish with lobe fins. Those are the ancestors of modern day amphibians, like the toad and the others that you know. Amphibians are most likely to have from these lobe-finned fishes. The net is also gone. Question 90. The vertebrate sense that underwent the least developmental change with the invasion of land was touch. So when vertebrates move from water to land, most of their senses went through a lot of evolutionary complexity to make them very, very adapted to their life on Earth. And the last time, I think that's when we met for the tutorial, I told you to read about some puzzles. One of them was Tectalic, another one was Lucy, another one was, I said you should read about Tectalic, Lucy, and which other puzzle did I say you should read about?
Archaeopteryx.
Yeah, Archaeopteryx. It's important to notice that the fossil called Tectalic is the link between evolution. The fossil called Tectalic shows the link between evolution of fishes and land vertebrates. So that fossil is a fish that has limbs like mammals, like reptiles. So it shows the evolutionary link between the fishes and the reptiles. And that's a very important fossil. So there is that evolutionary consideration, that link that has been drawn, that modern day land organisms made a transition from water to land. And when the transition was made from water to land, most of the sense organs had to be seriously developed, because the kind of sense of smell that you need in water is not as much as you need on land. Because in water, you'll be mostly relying on your sense of vibration and detecting changes in pressure to see the movement, or to get to notice the movement of predators. You wouldn't also need a very, very sharp eye view like you would need for land. And even though fishes or aquatic organisms have wide field of eye view, it's not as sharp as we have for land organisms like the birds, for example, that can see far away in that particular instance. In terms of hearing too, it's easy to hear in water than to hear in the air because of percussions and all that. Normally, ideally, the physics says that sound travels faster in air than in water, or something like that. I think you should look at that. But in evolutionary story, the hearing ability also had to undergo a lot of complex adaptation to make it modified to suit land on Earth. The balance is also something that was quite developed very sophisticatedly when they came on land, because you need to have extreme balance, especially if you are running and all that, so that you won't fall. And notice that the ear of organisms, especially the human ear, is an organ for two functions. It's for hearing and also for balancing. So your ear produces balance. If you lose the sense of your that's provided by your ears, you lose your sense of balance as well. So it's touch that was least developed when vertebrates invaded the land. And the earlier ancestors of vertebrates that invaded the land from water, one of those with the fossils that we found is Archaeopteryx. It's Tiktaalik. So go and read about Tiktaalik, and you get to know a lot about how vertebrates moved from water and invaded the land. Let's get to 100 and we close. Or when next do you guys have a class?
Please, we have it at 3 o'clock, lab.
So it's time.
Yeah, it's time.
Are you all going at the same time, or some of you?
Some of us. It's in batches.
Okay, so those who have to go now, you can